Yesterday in our parish experienced one of the best word to describe is the extremes of a pastoral ministry. Going from a very joyful experience to one that was quite sorrowful. And it began in the morning as he gathered with 6 families presenting 7 children to the church for the sacrament of baptism. And as you know from your own experience, it's a very special time for the parents, the godparents, the grandparents, and families, right? It's a time of joy, a time of hope, a time of celebration of this gift of life that God has entrusted to these parents, these families. Thanksgiving of this life and then asking for that new life that comes to them, to us, in the sacrament of baptism. When we're made anew, when we die with Christ to sin, in the waters of baptism to rise with him to new life. Then after that, I went immediately to an area hospital to visit a parishioner whose wife, whose mother was in a very serious condition. Celebrated the sacrament of the sick, prayed with them, talked about some of the decisions, the very difficult decisions in determining the kind of care that she would get, praying for, if it be God's will, for her to recover, but at the same time talking about her life, sharing the goodness, the gift of herself to her family and to her community. One of the things in common at these extremes, at the beginning, possibly at the end of life, that I was reflecting upon, was that common thread of how our lives are a gift. Our lives are not our own. Our lives come from God, and we're called to return to God. But yet, what's really important is, as I saw in the baptisms, was that those parents and godparents, in a very external way, but also internally, we're willing to do the best. We're willing, desiring to give the children the best that they could give them. And what better gift than the gift of baptism, that life with Christ? There's no better gift that we can give to our children than that life with Christ, that gift of faith that leads to salvation. What a wonderful gift, how precious that is. And at the ending of life, too, in praying with and in sharing the life of this parishioner, also seeing what are the things that we remember. It's not all the accomplishments that we might have on paper, but it's rather how we lived our life as a gift to one another. That's what they were remembering. The goodness of her life, the giving of herself. That her life was not her own, but her life was given in love to her family. That's that common thread that ran between those two experiences, and that's the thread that's part of today's scriptures and is central to what we celebrate in the Eucharist. Today, in a special way, as we celebrate the solemnity of the body and blood of Christ, it's talking about, we're celebrating what God is, not talking about, but what God is doing in a very real way. The gift of himself. The gift of himself that began in the incarnation in Christ and his fulfillment on that self-gift on the cross. Showing us that there's no extent to God's love and God's mercy. That God will go to any extent to bring us back, to reconcile us to himself, so that gift that was lost in the Garden of Eden, in our own sin, that gift that we can continue to lose in our sinfulness, but yet is regained in this gift of Christ to himself for us, of himself for us. That's a gift that we need to reconnect upon always. I think about where we find ourselves today, somewhere in between baptism and our being reborn into everlasting life. This is where it's more difficult. Like today, our graduates. Today we're blessing our graduates that we're celebrating the accomplishments that they have and the beginnings that are in front of them. These are special moments in our lives, and things are very clear, aren't they? We can look back and see those accomplishments, and we present those hopes for their future. But where it's really challenging for us is how do we, in our everyday living, that space in between, that space is for students, we all know how difficult it is in the middle of the semester, or the ending of the semester when all these papers are due and all the preparations are needed for exams. For us in our working day world, the stresses that come in everyday work, the difficulties we have in raising our families, providing for their future, the insecurities that we face as we grow older. All of these things is how do we continue to sustain ourselves in our living our Christian faith? To see that our lives and the lives of one another are not possessions, but rather they are gifts. That our life, like Christ's life, that we celebrate in the Eucharist, that we are called in our discipleship to give of ourselves in that same fashion. That the gift of the Eucharist cannot bear fruit in our lives unless that changes us, transforms our own will, sometimes which can be very selfish and self-centered, so that we can be transformed into giving of ourselves for others. It's no coincidence where we find Jesus in today's gospel, where we most of the times find Jesus. He's in the middle of the crowd. He's teaching people. He's healing those who are sick. He's comforting those that are in pain. He's showing God's great love and mercy. That's where we find Jesus today. And the disciples that wanted to disperse the crowd, to send them off, Jesus says, no, let's gather them. Let's bring them together. Bring them together as one flock. Let me feed them. But by the way, what can you do? Go feed them yourselves too. So what can you provide? 5 loaves and 2 fish. Doesn't seem like much. But yet, when all of that is presented in trust and in faith to the Lord, the miracle that He can do. God's love is always enough. God's love is abundant. Even when we look at the scarcity of our love, our life, sometimes our own self-giving, which seems to be so small at times, that can be transformed. We don't have to live in our smallness. We don't have to live in that small common denominator. We don't have to live in a way that we have to put up walls and fences around ourselves and live in that scarcity and to live in that fear. That is not how God created us to live. That is not what the Eucharist does for us. The Eucharist tears down those walls, those fences that we build around ourselves, so that we can live our lives for others. That in being fed in the body and blood of Christ, it transforms us to be those signs of hope. It allows us to feed one another, allows us to be there for one another. It allows us as a church to be a sign of what we celebrate here. This total self-giving of Christ for us, that we are called to do the same. Give them something yourselves to eat. Do this in memory of me. These are the commands of Jesus to the church, to each and every one of us. As we come and our deepest needs are satisfied, as we receive this real food, this real drink, the real presence of Christ in His body and His blood, so that we can be real people, that we can really, truly be present to those around us, to give of ourselves to those in need, so that we can see in the in-between time of the beginning of our lives to the rebirth of our lives, that we are sustained in what St. Paul tells us. That every time that we celebrate in the sacrament, we're remembering that death of Christ in a way that becomes real and present. And we do it until He comes again. That's the food for our journey. So let us allow this food to transform us. Let us allow this real presence of Christ to touch us in our depths, so that we can be that living sign of Christ to our world today.